2 low-carb loaves. Same recipe, only the flour changed. If you bake low-carb, almond flour is almost unavoidable, and that's where this experiment matters. This is almond flour versus keto wheat flour. One base batter, split by weight, same pan and same oven. So here's the real question. Which one rises higher? Which one gives you real bread texture? And which one would you actually bake again? Let's test it. The only variable we change is the flour. For the almond flour version, I'm using a finely ground blanched almond flour, the ingredient that has dominated low-carb baking for years. For the second loaf, we're using King Arthur keto wheat flour, which was designed specifically to mimic the structure of wheat flour while keeping the carbohydrate count low. So the question for this experiment is simple. If everything else stays the same, does the flour itself change the structure of the loaf? Let's mix the batter and find out. Both batters are mixed the same way. First, the wet ingredients are combined until smooth, and then the dry ingredients are incorporated until a uniform batter forms. At this stage, something important already becomes visible. Do you see it? The almond flour batter tends to be looser and slightly granular because almond flour behaves more like finely ground nuts than a traditional flour. The keto wheat batter, on the other hand, begins to develop a structure that looks much closer to a typical quick bread batter. That difference may not seem significant yet, but batter structure often predicts what will happen during baking. So the next question is whether that difference translates into the finished loaf. Both loaves go into the oven under the exact same conditions. The same temperature, the same rack position, the same pan size, the same pan. Keeping the baking conditions identical allows us to isolate what the flour itself is doing. As these loaves bake, there are two things we're watching for: height and internal structure. Those two characteristics determine whether a low-carb loaf slices cleanly or falls apart. When they come out of the oven, the difference becomes easier to see. Once the loaves cool, the real comparison begins. The first thing we examine is height and overall structure, and then Then we move to what I call the slice test. This is where low-carb bread often reveal their weaknesses. A loaf may look good on the outside, but crumble once it's cut. When slicing the almond flour loaf, you can see the crumb tends to be softer and more fragile, which makes the slices harder to handle. Now compare that to the keto wheat loaf. The crumb structure is noticeably tighter and more cohesive, allowing the slice to hold together much more like a traditional loaf. But structure alone doesn't tell the whole story. So the next step is to look more closely at the crumb itself. Side by side, the internal structure becomes clearer. Almond flour typically produces a soft crumb, but because it lacks gluten, the structure depends heavily on eggs and other binders. That's why many almond flour recipes behave more like a muffin or a cake than traditional bread. Keto wheat flour behaves differently. It forms a crumb that is more elastic and cohesive, which allows it to slice cleanly and hold its shape. For anyone trying to recreate the experience of bread while baking low carb, that difference in structure can matter. But ingredient choices always involve trade-offs. Almond flour works extremely well for certain things. Muffins, quick breads, and recipes where a softer crumb is actually desirable. However, when the goal is something closer to bread structure, almond flour can struggle to deliver that result. Keto wheat flour was designed specifically to solve that structural problem. And in this test, it clearly behaves more like traditional flour in terms of rise and sliceability. If you bake low carb, almond flour is almost unavoidable, which raises another important question. Does toasting almond flour actually improve how it behaves in baking? I tested that in another experiment. Click the video on your screen to watch